and founder of Something or Other Publishing, Wade Franson, is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksift, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode, Enlightenment and Capitalism.
Now, if anybody pays attention to those introductions, that's a youthful picture of me that's probably 10 years old. If you notice, there's gray here and there's no gray in that picture. So that's the younger version of myself. The other one it's great. We're an international media outlet, basically, as that's where I come from. The difference with those images is that they talk about LLCs and startups. Well, we function a little bit differently. We work with authors and academics, and I think that's where the nice marriage between Planksift and Soup exists. Now, today's a continuation of intellectual thought from a thought leader by the name of Cameron Cowan. Cameron's been on the show before. He's a great guy. And tonight, we're actually going to be talking about the Enlightenment, capitalism, the Protestant Confucius work ethic, lots of really exciting topics. So let's bring Cameron into the studio and see what he's been up to.
Hi.
Cameron, my man, how's it going today?
Good. It's very, we have a nice, lovely, sunny, moderate weather here in Seattle, which is very unusual for us. The rest of the country is rain and terrible, and we're having lovely weather. So it's a great day.
Well, that's great to get those pleasantries out of the way. What can you tell me about capitalism?
Well, Enlightenment and capitalism these two things are inextricably linked together. You wouldn't have one without the other. In fact, I was doing a little bit of pre-research, not that I needed to because I, spent all of undergrad studying this, but I kind of wanted to find something that was a nice sort of foundation for what we're talking about. And Harvard has this great thing called the Pluralism Project. And I like their explanation. The Enlightenment was a 17th and 18th century international movement in ideas and sensibilities, emphasizing the exercise of critical reason as opposed to intellectual dogmatism. It developed along with the rise of scientific thinking and stressed the importance of nature and the natural order as a source of knowledge. In reaction to the religious wars of Europe, many Enlightenment thinkers defended religious tolerance and religious freedom. A few even ventured outright religious skepticism. The emphasis on intellectual freedom and individual rights led to a conflict between the advocates of these new ideas and the political and religious establishments in Europe, most dramatically in the French Revolution. The Enlightenment in America mostly followed the more moderate traditions of the Scottish and English Enlightenments. Americans who read Isaac Newton, John Locke, or Thomas Reid appealed to the innate capacity for reason of common people, though only rarely did they question hierarchies based on gender, race, or class. Many hoped that natural philosophy might provide a way to transcend differences that arose within America's exceptionally diverse religious landscape. Leaders such as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, translated Enlightenment ideals of liberty, rights, and self-government into the underlying premises of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. And they go on and on. But for those that may not be familiar with the Enlightenment and its tremendous influence on what I call the two Enlightenment republics, which would be France and the United States, I thought that provided a nice little introduction. To understand the importance of Enlightenment and how it's linked to capitalism, you have to go back 100 years before and understand what came before capitalism, which was mercantilism. So mercantilism was basically kind of government ordained and licensed corporations who were allowed to do certain things and engage in certain business activities. Some of them, like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, were so independent they had their own militaries that operated under the auspices of the countries that they were going under. So very similar to China's economic model, this sort of state-backed corporations sort of thing. And there were very few corporations because they had to be state licensed. And so this led to huge kind of government-sponsored monopolies. And it also led, to some degree, to a lot of trade restrictions. So most frequently, it was, and especially this kind of coincided with the rise in the great colonial empires of the British nations. You had a lot of trade within an empire, but very little trade between empires under mercantilism, because it was really to protect local industry. So this also at a local level came out of the guild system, where every profession had a guild and you had to be licensed and controlled. And you still see vestiges of this in Europe today. Like the most famous example is pharmacists in Italy. If you go to pharmacology school in Italy, your chances of ever being able to afford a license to practice on your own in Italy are basically non-existent, because the number of licenses for pharmacists is fixed, like New York taxi medallions. And so, as a consequence, if you're going to school to be a pharmacist, you better be the son of a pharmacist whose license you can inherit, because otherwise you will always work for someone else. You will never work for yourself.
Okay. Cameron,
that's a legacy of mercantilism.
Yeah, you're hitting a point where I can't suspect. Well, that's kind of my limit. So,
all right.
So you've brought up a lot of points here, right? And I want to know please reveal for me what the consensus is about these systems as we compare capitalism to mercantilism, and optionally you can leave out the gilded systems, right? But as we progress out of the mercantile system into capitalism, has that overall been more beneficial for society? And are we seeing a pushback out of capitalism? And what are those levers?
Well, yes. I mean, capitalism, and here's where the Enlightenment comes in. Capitalism allowed a lot more freedom to create businesses and economic activity that wasn't directly licensed and sanctioned by the government. That when Adam Smith wrote this book called The Wealth of Nations, his vision of capitalism was artisans and small, relatively small companies creating and trading among themselves, but without needing to seek out a license to be a baker, a cooper, from a government entity. So that there was less restrictions to entering the profession, and the market would kind of get to decide. If three guys open a barrel shop and the first one makes great barrels, the second one are mediocre, and the third ones are crap, the market will say, we'll buy from a lot of one, some of two, and three goes out of business. That was the invisible hand that Adam Smith was talking about. Whereas under the old system, all three shops would have been kept open because they had three licenses, and that was how it would go. And capitalism also, and this also comes with the Enlightenment, the individual. And this also gets into religion, because Enlightenment was only possible with Protestantism. If Martin Luther had never gotten Protestantism off the ground, the Enlightenment probably would have never happened. Because there's a very big difference philosophically and institutionally between God as an institution and God as a personal relationship. So under the Catholic system, God was the purview of priests in a hierarchy. It had to be explained to you. In Protestantism, God was your own, and you could read the Bible in your own language and develop a personal relationship. That whole idea of the personal relationship with God extends to this sort of individual life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, also extends to an economic system that's optimized for that. Capitalism capitalism would have never developed without the rise of Protestantism. We've never gotten the Enlightenment without Protestantism. So that progression from the 15th century into the 18th century is vitally important because it changed how we conceive of ourselves. We're no longer just, members of the universal church. We're no longer just members of this kind of great society under the Pope and all this type of thing. We are individuals who can meet God on their own terms and meet the world on their own terms and create their own success rather than waiting on some greater, larger institution to create that for us. And that ultimately is what created the United States of America. That whole idea that we could, to the detriment of indigenous people, carve a civilization out of the wilderness, the land of the indigenous people, and do so in a way with freedom and liberty without having to answer to government every 5 minutes to do anything or make a move or make a decision or all this type of thing, was in the 18th century incredibly revolutionary. But it grows out of the Enlightenment as a philosophy of personal rights and the ability to use reason and the scientific method, and it also grows out of Protestant religion.
Wow, that's quite a vignette. I actually mentally had the cue in my head to bring Wade in about another 5 minutes, but the fact that you started to talk about religion and that transition point in civilized society, I'm going to bring him in right after this break, right after this commercial break. I'm going to bring him into the studio. A few weeks ago, we talked about defining religion, and there was an aspect of religion that we used in the definition that it was civilizing. So now we don't have to talk about that in terms of a verb. We can talk about it as acknowledging that it had a civilizing effect, or that it affected civilization. And I think what you're referring to, and please hold your answer, but I think what you're referring to is you're acknowledging that switch in paradigm and the legacy and the civilizing effect that the Protestant transformation brought into society, was in fact a civilizing force. So hold off on that. I'm going to play our first ad, and when we come back, we're going to have Wade in the studio. Hold on.
In a world increasingly disoriented and lacking spiritual values, many are turning to religion as a source of inspiration and comfort. Each person chooses their individual path, and if there is one thing we are known for, it's providing a positive platform for diverse points of view, to provide each of us the opportunity to discern truth for ourselves. Something or Other Publishing is proud to announce the creation of Royal Falcon Press imprint to feature the unparalleled talent of multiple writers who will bring uplifting and thought-provoking contributions to the body of religious literature, offering current spiritual insights and practical solutions to the challenges we face. Let's grow together as one of the most substantial spiritual communities on the internet. Register and explore a new way to achieve universal wisdom and reinforce your faith with all the surprises Royal Falcon Press has in store for you.
Wow. I very much appreciate Dan, who was just here and skedaddled. He'll be back in a little bit. And you, Cameron, I was just raptured, just listening. And I loved everything I was hearing. At the same time, I did want to jump in with questions, but I'm going to try to keep them really, short, so that I can just hear more of your perspective, because I think it's really interesting, important, and helpful. So tell me a little bit more about your understanding, awareness of how Protestantism enabled the Enlightenment and the American experiment, if you will. What are other distinctions and differences in your estimation between Protestantism and what came before it?
Well, there's the most notable one is the individualism aspect of it. However, the I think the bigger one, and what birthed capitalism out of mercantilism, was the idea that God blessed those who were righteous and upright. And so you kind of had this weird linkage between money and religion that had never really existed there before. I mean, let's think about it. In the Catholic Church, they literally recruit people who take a vow of poverty to live their whole lives to worship God. Over in the Protestant Church, we have prosperity gospel. Money is good.
Though I would say it didn't. Though I would say it didn't start out that way. I mean, I love the distinction you're making, but I think the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel is a somewhat new phenomenon. But I love that you're identifying the roots of it.
I mean, it is new, but if you look at Lutheran and Calvinist teachings of the 14th and 15th century, you have to remember the people who most got into Protestantism were the middle trading classes. They were the business people, they were the tradespeople. They were not the aristocracy usually. They were also not the poor. It was usually those people in the middle, and these people were people who owned a small business, owned a shop, all this type of thing, and they were used to making money and having transactions, forming capital, investing in things. And so this idea that God's blessings were not just the sacraments or a relic or things like that, but that God's blessings included your business doing well and your bank account doing well and all this type of thing, it's very different than the Catholic ideas about blessings from God, And you kind of see between, the former colonies of these empires, countries that come from Protestant colonial powers tend to be wealthier and do better than those who come from Catholic colonial powers. Because the priorities are different, In a Catholic country, you can be dirt, grindy, poor, and still be considered a righteous person because you go to Mass every Sunday, you do the community, all this type of thing. In the Protestant world, it's, well, you're grindingly poor. What are you doing wrong? How have you sinned? That's a very different religious perspective.
Right.
Those are diametrically opposed. And out of that, we then get capitalism.
And zillions of scriptures come to mind. I'm going to not go there, but I do want to call out one. When I say not go there, what I mean is, as you know, my foundation is deeply rooted in the actual words, right? And I'd love to explore some of the theological underpinnings of that change. Won't do that, but I will just call out one verse where Jesus said, "I come that you might have life and have it more abundantly." Right? That would be one that the Protestants would latch onto, whereas that would
and
be
they
one
did, and they have done. Yes,
that would be one where the Catholics would have, let's deep six that. Let's say it only in Latin, perhaps.
Well, and also you can also redefine abundance. So in a communal society sort of thing, abundance can be the county fair. It can be a communal meal.
It can simply be spiritual abundance, the richness of the spiritual fruits and blessings. Right.
Yes. Or it also can be a new church, a new holy order. Yes. I mean, there's all these kind of other ways to define it. Whereas in the Protestant world, because of who the people were, and that's the important part, because of who was interested in that aspect of Christianity, abundance became synonymous with money.
Well, and was there sort of an effort to get away from taxation, i.e. the church, being the major source of tax collectors?
Well, yes. I mean, we have to remember in this time, church tithes were collected as taxes. It was nothing voluntary. It was required. And the church was supported by the state. And in most European countries, that's still true to this day.
Yep.
And even
albeit vaguely, right? So, for example, I was in Germany, and you had to opt out of paying your tax to the church, right? They would, whereas we might fill out on a form, religious persuasion, and you might say Catholic or Protestant. You do that on a form in Germany, and that's where the government will direct your church tax, which is automatically collected unless you specifically opt out of it.
Yes, and that is true in Denmark and the Netherlands still. I mean, it's this is a very, and we have never had that in this country.
Right.
And in fact, our Constitution prohibits prohibits the very idea of having, Congress shall make no law respecting religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And it was to kind of break the back of that system. And that's the Enlightenment of the natural order and personal reason and individualism and all this type of thing. Dan asked me a question. He said, was there a similar transition? And in the Muslim world, are you aware? No, because Islam has not had the Enlightenment. The divides in Islam are very different. The divides between Sunni and Shia have to do with a matter of respecting the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, and also whether Islam can be reformed. That's where they're not there yet. In fact, people get very mad at me when I say Islam is stuck in the 13th century. But I'm not wrong. Get mad at me if you want to, but I'm not wrong. They haven't even had the Renaissance. They haven't had the Protestant Reformation. They haven't had the Enlightenment in their religion. And so in Andalusia, in Spain, if you're a non-Muslim, you have to pay a tax for the privilege.
Well, interestingly,
they're still doing that to this day in 2020, in the year of our Lord 2023.
Right.
If you live in Andalusia and you're non-Muslim, you have to pay for the privilege.
Our Muslim friends, however, would be quick to point out some of the origins of the Enlightenment. They would point out do stem from Islam, and I believe that is verifiable. It might be an interesting course of study, but that does not mean I disagree with you. I 100% agree with you, which is why in my previous religious experience, we felt like we would teach that you had to be open-minded, right? God had to open your mind to the truth. And as a Baha'i today, we would emphasize the independent investigation of the truth and the essential unity of religion and science. However, in my prior fellowship, once you had discovered the truth, right, much of which was actually true. In other words, there was so much error in religion. Much of what we were uncovering was in fact truth. Now, we also had our own versions of error mixed in, but nonetheless, there was this certain opening of the mind to understand all these things. But once you had accepted the truth, then you should quickly close your mind to protect what you have, hold fast to the faith, to the faith once delivered. Hold fast to the faith once delivered, lest the enemy come and steal it from you. Let no man take your crown. Satan goes about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. So, whereas Islam did bring many new concepts and was actually a trigger for the Enlightenment, to your point, like most religions, once that orthodoxy begins to set in, then you are forced to reject new truth.
and that actually really defines the Sunni Shia split.
Yes, amen.
That's really where that divide happened.
Which happened very early, correct? How early did that split come?
About 150 years out from the ascension of the prophet.
Right.
So it didn't take long. The Christians were a little bit slower. But Islam is also the youngest of the three Abrahamic religions. So they had an opportunity to learn from the mistakes of Christianity and Judaism. So they were able to speed things along. And yeah, there's a lot of these sort of, and I always find this with religion. If you go around to the religions of the world, you'll find common principles and all this type of thing. And the outstanding example germane to this conversation is Confucianism and the Confucian work ethic in Asia.
Yeah, please share a little bit about that.
Well, one of the great things that has been studied in politics and economics is why certain countries are wealthy and why certain countries aren't. And as I was telling Dan right before we started into this segment, is that Protestant descended countries from Protestant colonial powers tend to be wealthier than those who come from Catholic colonial powers. Obviously the outstanding examples being from Britain, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa to some greater or lesser degree. If you look at the countries that come from Catholic descended colonial powers, you'll be pressed to find countries of comparable wealth. Even in Latin America, the only one that comes close is Brazil and Mexico, but those are not on par with the Big Five. If you look at former French colonies, good luck. Um, is that I mean, it's just not. It's a different ethos because you have this divide of what does it mean to have a meaningful and purposeful life. And in the Protestant world, and this is also true in the Confucian world, it was to trade, to be successful, to do good things. There's a certain dialectical materialism in that isn't present in the Catholic ethos, which is focused on holy behavior and sacraments and mass attendance and prayer. You don't need money to do those things. Incidentally, Islam has a similar thing. You acknowledge the prophet, you pray 5 times a day, you do these things, you wash in a certain way, wear something. You don't need to be wealthy in order to do that. And most Islamic countries weren't until they discovered oil. Then they got wealthy very quickly. But that whole idea about what it means to live that fulfilling life, when you tie money into it, you get this sort of worship of money. You get this, and that's why to some degree capitalism is a holy order, in a very weird way, because, and this is why in Asia you get Japan, which is very Western, you get South Korea, China to some lesser degree, because you have this whole work hard, be successful, be fruitful. This is the holy mission. That isn't true for other religious backgrounds. That's why India struggles. It's not just their geography, which is terrible, or their weather, also bad. It's partly Hinduism and what it means to live a fulfilling life. It's a very different sort of economy.
One of the most amazing things. Well, one of the most poignant examples of that. Let me unravel my tongue from speaking too quickly. As I was reacting to what you were saying, when I traveled in India and I made number of trips because I was helping to establish a foundation for homeless children in Chennai during one point in my life, because as a sort of rejection of all of that and other aspects of the Protestant view of the world, I was now trying to be a little bit more like Mother Teresa during this one phase. But it struck me how in India you could celebrate as a holy man somebody who had decided to dedicate his life to the gods. And the way he did it was by holding his arm in the air, which he had now done for 18 years and never let his arm down. And of course, after a while, it was not possible for him to put his arm down. And he essentially crippled himself in his devotion to God by holding his arm in the air, some commitment, some vow he had made to the gods. But no one would say that's really dumb, right? No one would say that's really dumb in India. They would honor and praise this man for his devotion to his God. And it just seems so strange, but you're aggregating the outcome of some of those attitudes and saying this keeps the nation poor. Some of the underlying attitudes that could lead to such a thing being celebrated.
There's a whole area of political science and economics that studies this. And to that point, there's a comment from YouTube. Jet4231 said the love of knowledge, which was blossoming in the Islamic Golden Age, its waning coincided with the Crusades, which caused all the problems and exposed the Europeans to the love of knowledge, which was gradually brought to Europe, igniting the Renaissance. Yes, that. There's also the collapse of the Byzantine Empire and the spread of Greco-Roman culture throughout the rest of Europe, which gets into a great book called How Ireland Saved Civilization.
Wait a minute. How did Ireland save civilization? Or are you referring to the stone that comes from, was it Jeremiah? Or
the only reason we have Plato and Aristotle is because those manuscripts were saved in Irish abbeys after the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Ireland saved civilization. And because it was removed, it was far away from the action of the conflict, those things survived. We would not have that legacy of Greco-Roman philosophy without Ireland and those abbeys and monks who assiduously saved that stuff. So yes, that definitely there's definitely some linkage there. But when it comes to how we find a fulfilling life and all this type of thing, putting money, success at the center of your life and calling it God's blessings and all this type of thing, Studies have shown this leads to countries who have per capita more wealth than those who have a different cultural background. And there's a whole aspect of political science and economics that studies this and why some nations are rich and some nations are poor, despite, all the pieces being there. Like India has all the parts, but they don't have a car. All the parts are there for India to be a superpower, and they're not. And when you start to dig into culture and religion and all this type of thing, you start to understand why that is. And it also explains why the West has been so dominant for 500 years. Why economically, neoliberal capitalism pretty much rules every country on this planet with a couple exceptions, especially in a post-Soviet era, because this, and here's where you kind of get, it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it's very liberating. Fraternité, égalité, liberté in France. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's very liberating for the individual. And especially in Asia, in collectivist societies, that's real liberation because you're getting out of the anthill sort of thing. And that's
so I'm sensing your individual collectivism is a union of East and West.
It is. That is very much the point of individual collectivism. Yes, the two great systems compete in the 20th century, and I realized that we need both. Go watch the video from 2 weeks ago for more on that. And Confucianism also gave rise to that as well. And so we've looked at, what is it about Confucianism and Protestantism that allowed countries to do well and become wealthy and become powerful. And it has a great deal to do with the ability of individuals to kind of make their own way, take risks, discover things, pursue knowledge, pursue that natural order, pursue the natural philosophy, pursue an evidence-based learning rather than just merely following church dogma. That created new thoughts, new discoveries, new science, which led to new technology. That technology needed capital in order to run. That capital was available because you had this large trading middle class that was doing business all over the world. And so, you kind of draw this straight line of you wouldn't have one without the other. And the Enlightenment could never happen without Protestantism, and those two couldn't happen with capitalism couldn't happen without those two things. And people don't realize that we're living at the end of a 500-year thread. This has been going on for 500 years, and we're reaching the terminus, and now it's time for something else.
So I want to come back to this after a quick commercial break. But before we do, I'd like to get your assessment. Thumbs up, thumbs down, some thumbs sideways. How are we? Where are we at in the ongoing, unfolding, evolutionary development of civilization in terms of digesting this shift, this change that leads people to not be content with grinding poverty, but also seems to be careening the world to a total planetary collapse due to rampant materialistic consumption-driven greed?
I would say we're solidly thumbs down on that. The world is trending towards more consumption, not less. And that's a very hard conversation. Who wants to tell farmers in Brazil they can't clear cut their land to grow profitable crops to send their kids to college? And I mean, how can you tell developed countries, for the sake of the planet, you can't do to your country what the West did to its countries for centuries? I mean, that's a very hard conversation to have. And when you get into international development,
or even to bring it back home, which I'm trying to tee up the next ad that we're going to play, which is for a new author from Something or Other Publishing, who is an African-American corporate executive who has written a small primer or primer. Which is it, Cameron? Primer or primer?
We're in America, so primer.
Thank you. I've heard primer said, and it always irritates me. So primer for an underserved community, young African Americans, on financial literacy, right? So bringing it close to home, who are we to say that those who are now feeling perhaps in recent years, despite certain movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, which in some senses is necessary, but in other may tend to reinforce the idea that you're a victim and that you cannot succeed.
Yeah.
This gentleman has written a book, Chasing Dreams, as a primer for financial literacy for young entrepreneurial minorities. So we'll play that ad, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this conundrum of enlightenment leading to material success, leading to the destruction of the entire species. Stay tuned.
If you want to launch your venture and pursue your ambitions but are unsure how to begin, then Tom Hampton's Chasing Dreams is the perfect book for you. Through his 50 years of expertise in the business world, Tom has perfected the skill of breaking down complex topics into easy-to-follow steps that anyone can comprehend. This book can equip you with the critical financial knowledge needed to gain control of your future and start paving the way for your success. Dedicated to the women who inspired his entrepreneurial journey, this book is a relatable and accessible read for all dreamers, regardless of their professional background. Order your copy now on Amazon or by emailing orders.supllc.com.
And I do have the QR code out there. Please do support our show, support our sponsors by picking up your phone, holding it to that QR code, and taking a look at Tom Hampton's book on Amazon. By the way, this book over the last few weeks has become a #1 rated hot new release across multiple categories on Amazon. Congratulations to Tom for the success of your book. So I brought Dan back in from that neighbor country up north. And of course, Canada being a somewhat minimally kinder, somewhat minimally gentler, right, version of America in terms of capitalism. So Cameron, you gave it a solid thumbs down in terms of our ability to somehow rein it back in. Why? Why do you think we will not be able to slow down the rampant rise of materialistic consumption-driven economies?
Well, I mean, most people, especially in developing countries, would like to be able to live a certain amount of lifestyle. They would like to have flushing toilets and toilet paper. They would like to have, consumable, inexpensive food. A lot of people would like to have, a moped or a car.
I'm reminded of that great song by Ambrosia, Living in Angola, off of their Life Beyond LA, right? Little known group, Ambrosia, Life Beyond LA, Living in Angola. Go look it up. I'm sure it's on YouTube somewhere. I'm dating myself, but it's an amazing song. Contrasting people in Angola looking at us complaining about our first world problems back in the 70s.
Yes, and the reality is that people, we've had probably over the last 50 years one of the most mass human migrations since the last ice age of people moving to wealthier, more developed countries, with more education, and the internet has accelerated this because now, much like how Americans look to Europe and say, we pay a lot of taxes and get none of that stuff. What's wrong with that? The rest of the world has had a chance to look into how people in wealthy countries live. And they would like a car. In 1991, almost no one in China had cars. Everyone rode bicycles. Now, the opposite is true. They can't build lanes fast enough. And so, people are, want to have a certain amount of lifestyle. They want to be able to, not be grinding in subsistence farming and all this sort of thing. And so, but the unfortunate reality is that as lifestyles increase, the amount of carbon you put out increases, the amount of impact you have on the planet increases, all this type of thing, and that puts stress on our economic systems, and it puts stress on our ecological systems. To get into agriculture, pesticides, insecticides, and fertilizers, and feeding 8 billion people. I have a whole essay in the book coming up on that. That's a whole other conversation.
But let me comment on that, and longtime listeners know of the sort of discussion back and forth between Dan and I on the issue of climate change, and my emphasis on the first commandment, right? So I appeal to this from the perspective of helping conservatives understand the roots of where they come from, helping religious conservatives understand something that they may have missed, that the very first commandment given by our Creator was, and it wasn't even a commandment, it was more like a purpose, a role, the nature, even going beyond a commandment. I have created you in my image to do what? To dress and keep the garden. The point is, I have created the Garden of Eden, which in fact is the whole planet. The Garden of Eden isn't just this little postage stamp of land between two rivers that are known and two rivers that are deemed mystical in the Near East, but rather it is the entire jewel that we saw that the astronauts saw the first time they saw the Earthrise, this glowing blue marble floating in space. That is the Garden of Eden, and we were put here, it says right from the beginning, to dress and keep that garden. Anyone who, since the Enlightenment and the rise of science, has gone in the direction of this disproves the Bible can go take another look at it and say, well, wait a minute, how did those people know that such a statement in the opening pages would be so prescient as to define the crisis of our age, which is so thoroughly described in the book of Revelation? So as a believer, I'm saying, look, anyone who claims religion had better, as Joni Mitchell wrote in Woodstock, get back to the garden and dress and keep this planet. That's the appeal. So is the outcome of the Enlightenment and this rampant materialism partially due to the fact that in addition to getting smart and wise and learning how to create more beneficial societies from the perspective of feeding everybody, clothing everybody, giving people a little bit more leisure time and lots of opportunities, but also in the process then throwing out religion and the baby with the bathwater has now left us defenseless against those excesses of human nature that religion was teaching us to overcome and to bring into submission, bring our desires into submission to a higher purpose.
Well, there's a lot there.
I said I would keep my questions succinct, and I did not do what I said I would.
I am now. Well, let me try to work through some of that. I am not at all religious anymore in any way that's recognizable to anyone other than myself. And so I kind of reject the keep and dress the garden premise. Do I think we should have good ecological management? Absolutely. Do I think our present green agenda is the way to do it? Absolutely not. Half these technologies cause more waste than the ones they're replacing. It's not getting us anywhere. In fact,
why is that?
It's making the problem worse.
Why is that? Just from not in a specific, but in a general overview, because I think you're right, and I think it's systemic. It's not just this technology or that technology.
Feel good. It has nothing to do with actually doing things. It makes people feel good. And a lot of it has to do with the narrative. And this is where I complain about narratives. Much of, when we get into climate and ecology and all this type of thing, much of the narrative is extremely disingenuous on that subject. And it's not at all a reflection of the science and what climate scientists think. And it's also not a reflection of how limited our knowledge actually is on climate. And that's I've always said, politicians are being asked to write public policy on something we do not fully understand. This is an impossible task. And so in the process of grasping at straws, we are saying we're going to have all electric cars by 2035 and all this sort of thing, even though most of the stuff is
because it's political pandering, right?
The problem.
It's political pandering.
But that's because the climate scientists don't have enough data to come out and say, here's what we need to do. Here's how to do it. They're beginning
to identify the problem, and they're beginning to identify it more accurately, but they have yet to remotely achieve the degree of excellence, for lack of a better word, to propose a solution that does not quickly evidence itself as being worse than the problem. I know an old lady who swallowed a fly, right?
Yeah.
And so let's down a spider now.
Yes, and the thing about it is the reality is climate is incredibly complex.
Right.
We had a small ice age in the
As is the
13th
human,
century.
as is the human economy, and as are
Of
the
course.
markets, and anything you would propose to try to solve this incredibly complex problem that you don't understand. You have no idea of the collateral damage of the thing you're proposing.
Yes, and that gets into unintended consequences and how, in in a good functioning world and government, we would want to do the homework to mitigate those as best we can. We don't know about the black swans, but we can at least find the white and the gray swans. Um and and mitigate those as much as possible, but also be responsive when they come up in the normal course of human events. In any system, you are going to have people that are going to find ways to achieve their goal, either the fastest way through the system or by circumventing it. And we see this everywhere. It's why people don't use their turn signal on the highway. It's the reason that they cross 3 lanes to make an exit. I live in Seattle. These are the things people do around here. We have the worst traffic in the nation for a reason. All these things. People are going to find ways to do what they're going to do, either through the system or circumventing it. So a smart person builds a system that makes it as easy as possible for people to do stuff, so that your amount of people circumventing the system is as small as possible. This was one of the, to kind of bring the conversation back to the subject, this was one of the things that made capitalism so appealing. And this is what made something like the Enlightenment so appealing, is because it was able to get out from under the dogma of the church. It was able to get out from under the, orthodoxy of how the world was based upon nothing more than the Bible and religion with no actual evidence. And taking that to economics,
and the ideas of the
you have a
priests, right?
good, you want to sell it, someone wants to buy it, let's make a transaction, let's move on, let's sell it to as many people as possible, all this type of thing. That whole idea of, hey, let's just do without having to respect, this government license or this guild or this other thing, it completely broke those systems down, so people had a faster and easier way of achieving their goal.
So having brought Dan in here, and then having me along with the guest who should dominate, but me then also dominate, Dan, you have been working with some brilliant economists, and these economists are also looking at the issue of the global economy, how the economy is structured and what the solutions might be there, specifically from the light of this question, right? How can we change human behavior? How can we curb the spike of materialism? What can you share from those discussions that you're having with people like Steve Keen and others on this topic? And you're on mute, apparently. Or perhaps he's unexpectedly on mute. So so Dan, try to figure that out and keep talking. And when we hear you, we'll suddenly go back over to you. But none of us can hear you, Dan. So we'll continue while you work on fixing that. And I'm gonna just
no, it's fine. I'll vamp for a moment I'll vamp
There
for a
we go.
by
Maybe...
saying, oh, there we go. We have
it.
Dan. Good. See,
There we
I
go.
I covered for you. There, yes.
I think with any new person that comes into the ecosystem of Daniel Sanderson, I intellectually open them with open arms if they're honest, and they're being intellectually honest. Okay, and so in order of appearance, from my left to right, because I'm switching myself this way, we have Cameron Lee Cowan, and we also have Wade Franson, and the spirit of Professor Steve Keen. Okay, so let me go from Steve Keen backwards. Steve Keen is a dear friend, and I have publicly called him the greatest living economist. I wholeheartedly believe that. This was sentiment that was shared by Vox Day, who sits on, he's a far-right nationalist, according to Wikipedia, so politically opposite to what Steve Keen is. And then we have my good friend Wade Franson, who I would say half the time he wears his heart on his sleeve, on his collar, on his shirt, on his pants. It's everywhere. It's just, that's Wade. Okay. But he has this ability to project a very profound intellect. Okay. And then we have Cameron, who is somewhat the newest addition to this club of Daniel. And I was actually surprised because almost every position that I've talked to Cameron about seems to be opposite to what Daniel thinks. Right. So the reason why I set the stage from this is that it's actually very difficult to find a common ground where people who value their intellectual abilities can actually meet each other and have a conversation. I mean, not just have a conversation, but I am flabbergasted by the complete lack of acceptance or acknowledgement about the climate reality. That's how I see it. Okay. Wade has kind of come around by acknowledging that there's a, the dressing of keeping the garden. It's right from the opening phrase of the Bible. I get that. So that's good. From Cameron's perspective, I do see a point where we can agree, and that is that we need a healthy planet, one that integrates biodiversity. But what I'm hearing back from Cameron is that it's so politicized with the carbon crisis or the climate change scare. Okay. So I've been toying with an idea for a long time, and it falls into a realm of universal basic income. It's like a universal basic income, and it's like guaranteed job wages. But the reason why I'm bringing this up right now, Cameron, is because you had mentioned about the accelerant of the acceptance of ideas. And one of the things that happens in this phenomenon of culture for the acceptance of ideas is if people can actually realize their issues faster. And so I'll be launching something that will scaffold that out. But basically, think of it something like this. If people could get a salary, a wage, a living subsistence based off of their average country's, like the average wealth for an individual in a country. Okay. So arguably it's a little bit leaning towards a nationalistic framework, but let's face it, the US is the one that is, finished the race first, right? Okay. So I think that's one of the fallacies that we see when we look at all of the countries and we have to say we're going to bring up everybody to an equal level. Well, the world health organizations, they can't do that. We're just getting out of the gates by being able to get clean drinking water and basic necessities provided to some of the, well, we can't say it, third world countries. You guys get my point. How are we going to magically wave some sort of economic GDP magic wand and expect everybody to kind of balance out and equalize in something that is catalyzing our whole planet?
So Dan, let me bring it back to earth, and thank you so much for sharing. That's an idea for discussion, perhaps on another show. I don't take that in the wrong way. I want to bring this back to the Enlightenment, Cameron, and something that you said earlier. I loved that you can, and here's the tie-in, Dan. I loved that you contrasted the French Revolution and Great Britain and then America, right? Because the French Revolution was more radical, right? And what Dan is proposing is a radical solution that I don't even want to start on tonight because, it's...
Well, I would correct. It's not a radical situation. Because
whatever term you want to put.
No, but I agree with, just wait, I agree with, or I disagree with the French Revolution. This was revolutionary in terms of, well, we know that heads flew and it was very bloody. And that's not what I'm proposing.
And you think somehow magically you could snap your fingers and it would be peaceful to do the kind of thing that you're proposing?
No, I mean, like you said, it's probably going to be something for a different show, right? But
Right,
what I'm saying is
exactly.
it's a non-violent approach. It's meant to inspire, it's not to be forceful. There's nothing forceful about it. It's purely a democratic process. If somebody wants to sign up for the program, they sign up for the program. That's it.
Let me bridge a few gaps here. When I was involved in Occupy Wall Street in Denver, that was the first time I ever heard the words universal basic income. And that term, hanging around in leftist circles, has bumped around for a long time. And last year I did a podcast on investigating it, and I pulled clips from Andrew Yang and all this sort of thing, because he made it very popular in the 2020 election. And I am not a fan of the universal basic income as such. I think there's something to be said for people having usefulness. People need to feel like they're doing something that gives meaning to their lives. People need that sort of thing. And I think that is important. However, I do also see where trying to, solve the wealth inequality of the world is obviously a very pressing priority. I think a lot of that has to do with how we handle things structurally. A lot of countries would do a lot better if all their natural resources were not owned by foreign corporations owned by Western countries.
Yeah.
That's particularly
Cameron,
true
let
if you
me
live in
jump in.
Africa.
We
So
need to-
we
Yep.
can handle these
Yeah, but-
problems and start to, if we look at these big structures and say, okay, the money's there, why isn't it in the pockets that people are supposed to be into? And we start to look at these kind of grand systems and be like, all right, let's, as I tell people, let's change the order of the trapdoors. Let's replumb and get things moving to where it does, as I always like to say, the most good for the most people.
Yep, I want to jump in and say thank you. You grounded it. You grounded it in a couple of things, and we need to go to a commercial break here as well. But I just want to call out what you said about usefulness and purpose. Having lived in Sweden, it's always been on my radar, and I've always paid attention to what's going on there. Sweden probably came as close as any nation has done to moving in that direction, and you started to see massive teen suicides. There's a correlation there between the need to have meaning and purpose and make a contribution. So not to in a binary oversimplified caricature kind of way say your idea would never work. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm just saying the devil is in the detail, right? As to how do you move to a system and how do you gradually change all kinds of complex things that incorporate human psychology versus just some scientist in a laboratory coming up with a big eureka. I've figured it out. The answer to all human existence.
Well, and let's also not forget there's lots of use cases to provide people an income to survive when they can't work. Disability should be far more broad in this country than it is, and should be offered to more people who genuinely can't keep a job. Things like Social Security should be, we don't fund it enough in this country, and people are not provided, with enough income to really live in their older age. If I had my way, I would nationalize our retirement system. There's lots of use cases for where I think, the government does need to cut checks. But I think for a lot of people, that isn't quite the solution. There's a more elegant way to do it.
So I'm now going to go to commercial break. Thank you. Here we go. Something or Other Publishing, with their own version of usefulness. Take a look at how you can get involved as an author, a reader, or a service provider.
And welcome to Something or Other Publishing, or as our friends like to call us, Soup. Soup is a platform that connects authors, readers, and service providers in one convenient place. Choose Soup if you're an author with a great book idea and you're looking for a publisher offering hands-on coaching and some of the best royalties in the business. Or if you're a reader who enjoys engaging with celebrated and emerging authors. We already have over 3,000 of them, and more are joining every day. You can even win free books by voting on their book ideas. Or maybe you're a service provider and you're looking to engage with over 3,000 authors. We're here to help. So whether you're an author, a reader, or a service provider, you're in the right place at Soup. Contact us at help@soupllc.com to learn more.
And again, there's that QR code, whether you'd like to contribute to one of our anthologies, publish your book, get involved in the reader program where free books are given away every month, or a service provider helping to get in on that ecosystem, use that QR code, go check out Something or Other Publishing. So full disclosure, we all love to go overtime. Tonight, my father made a trip from Texas, 970 miles that he drove in one day. I'm not going to tell you how old my father is, but obviously a man who can do that must have a very young, virile son, which is me. And that young, virile son needs to go spend a little time with him because he's jumping in the car and driving back to Texas 976 miles tomorrow. So I'm going to have to bail here on this unbelievably fascinating show, which I really, really want to stay for. I love this stuff. So we're going to have Cameron back on with a part 2, but he and Dan will continue. I'm just going to leave one more input here. Actually, you know what? I'm not even going to do that because it would lead to me having to stay and unpack it. So with that, 9 o'clock, Dan, I'm going to hand the control of the show back over to you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We will have Cameron back on more often. May I reveal, Cameron, that we have now entered into agreements to publish your collected works and future works to the degree that we continue to keep you happy at Something or Other Publishing, and that tonight
I guess you can't say no.
And that,
no, everything is in order. No, you can't. No, it's fine. Everything is in order.
Nope, you can't do that.
I mentioned that I have a newsletter going out tomorrow morning to my readers talking about this, so it's a known thing. Contracts have been signed, things are happening. So it's
and
fine.
I think there will be press releases coming out as well by the team, and much more to come, including Something or Other Publishing giving away a free copy of Cameron's book, What the Hell is Going On, to the person that Dan and Cameron think gave the most insightful, helpful, provocative, or whatever they choose comment of the evening. Thanks, everyone. Time for me to bail.
You wait.
Yes. Before we did the commercial break, you seemed unhappy and wanted to say something, and I would like to find out what you were going to say.
Well, basically, it's a very hard thing to develop, but if I bring up an idea about universal basic income, or I bring up an idea of guaranteed jobs, I understand that the evidence for this is not great based off of our current situation. And I'm not even proposing that they fall within that realm. I feel that we live under an oppressive God spelt this way, the following way, not GOD, GDP. We are production-centric civilization that needs to shift into things that properly account for the biodiversity of the planet. Now, the incentive would be one agent at a time. Okay. The advertisement comes across and it's from the US government because Cameron Lee Cowan is a US citizen. And it says, basically, Cameron, the average income for a US citizen is $60,000 US a year. Okay. I'm not sure what it is. I think that's what it is for the US. It's extremely high on an average. Mm-hmm. So anybody that wants to sign up with that gets that amount of money. Now I'm not saying that people are not going to have purpose. There has to be an enormous purpose around supporting a healthy biodiversity, keeping your carbon down, participating in the community, and keeping your carbon footprint down to a minimum, right? That's the whole idea. If you agree to that, you get to sign on. You get that income, okay? And you'll probably be hard-pressed to even spend that income. So what will happen? It'll accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, okay? Now, will eventually the money devalue? Possibly. Could inflation go up? Yes, possibly. If we got enough people on board, yes, it would happen that way. I'm guessing, right? But this is the only solution that I can see to mobilize in a democratic way. Almost anybody that I talk to in liberal circles that is concerned about climate change, their life's work is heading towards a trajectory of policy change, which is a top-down, force you to do things that is going to cause a problem at the baseline. Okay, and I'm saying we need a movement from the ground up, and from the ground up that means average citizens who say, I will sign up and get that amount of money, and I will do this, and this for that. That's what I'm referring to. And I think the incentive is there. I think the purpose is there. And if the purpose isn't there, then don't sign up for it. We want people that want to be able to make a difference. And I think it's an incredibly, I mean, maybe because it's my idea, but it's like, it's platonic. You gotta start somewhere. And I believe in that individual. I believe in democracy. I believe in the fact that we can mobilize and make a movement one individual at a time. But we as governments, we need to put our money where our mouth is. And if the economy includes the health of the biodiversity of the planet, then we need to properly account for that. And we're not doing it. We're still caught in a system that's praying to GDP, right? And there is no purpose in that. It's an empty God. That's my point.
Yes. Well, and to bring the conversation full circle, one of, I think, the faults in Protestantism to the Enlightenment to capitalism is that we replaced God with money. And our current, obsession with production and growth and stock prices and all this type of thing is not necessarily, it's not great for the planet. It's not great for people. I kind of take more of a view the planet will be just fine as the humans who are in trouble, George Carlin. But I do, I'm a big fan of doing what's good for people. I mean, the heart of individual collectivism is helping people to do well so that society benefits thereby. And so I want to be more human focused on a lot of this stuff. And I think that is, I think that that's a very important idea. To answer Brent Ansonson's question, most proposals don't have necessarily a cutoff. Like Andrew Yang was like, just send everybody $2,000 regardless, sort of thing. That was Andrew Yang's proposal in the 2020 American presidential election. As far as who will become rich off this idea, anybody who's really good at not spending money, anybody who's really good at living a very limited, frugal lifestyle that doesn't need a lot of stuff or require a lot from society or needs to go a lot of places or anything like that. I mean, that's kind of who that the potential wealthy would be. However, I think not making money and production and growth and all that type of thing the raison d'etre of our whole economy is probably a better system and a better idea. However, I think it's also difficult to strike that balance because this planet does not allow homeostasis for very long. They did a study in the 1960s in Colorado in the plains, and the scientists hired a bunch of people to go around and study every single animal, every single insect, every single blade of grass, and catalog it and follow the deer around. What did it eat? When did it eat? How much? All this data, tons and tons of data about every aspect of the Great Plains ecosystem. And they fed it into computers, and they found it was extremely chaotic. They were anticipating some well-mannered, ordered, stable system, and it wasn't. Yeah. It actually was the exact opposite. Things were rising up, dying off things. It was chaotic. This planet does not do homeostasis for very long. So I think whatever system you set up if you don't start with people first, people are going to find a way around it to achieve their goal. And I think you're going to end up with people doing even more dangerous and destructive things to get the stuff that they want or think they want. Now, should we have less advertising? Yeah, probably. Do we need branded goods? No. Do we necessarily need consumption as we've known it for the last 100 years? No. Should we have things that last longer and don't go obsolete in 5 years? Absolutely. Should we have clothes and electronics that last way longer? Absolutely. It's more sustainable for the economy, more sustainable for the planet. But here's the thing, and here's where our brains have to shift. That system is good for people. It's not good for stock prices. It's not good for corporations. And in this country, that's who runs our country here in America. It's not good for that.
Mm-hmm.
And until we move away from that capitalistic idea of money making money for the sake of money, which is really kind of capitalism in a sentence, we can't recreate a system that focuses on people as its primary goal of improving the life of people and citizens. And over the last 50 years, since Thatcher and Reagan, we've had a system that has actively worked against that.
Right. Now, I see that. So this is where we disagree, because your starting point is systemic. Your starting point is fix the system and then everything else will come along, right? It's a very Marxist approach, right? Whereas I'm saying it's a more organic approach. It's a more ground up from the people approach, right? And so the people, and then I'm actually emphasizing on the market. The market can do that. If you start with hiring one person and that scales to 10 people, which scales to 100 people, which is 1,000 people, that doesn't affect the economy. 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000 people on this will affect the economy. And the plea, and now all of a sudden politics have to change, because it's not about what you can take. It's not about what you need to be given. It's about how you can serve your country. Do you need to help with supply lines? Do we need to get food in the grocery stores? Do you need to help plant trees? Do you need to go and help catalyze or put into catalogs the ecosystems? Now, one thing I want to add is that I do agree with you about them being complex systems, okay, and probably chaotic systems. But with the vision of the late and I think great E.O. Wilson, we have an ability at this point to look at. We only have 1/10 of the record of a biodiversity even categorized. What we need to do is we need to start looking at the other 90% of the biodiversity. That if you go out into your backyard, into the rich soil in your backyard, you pick up a handful of soil. There's more diversity and biodiversity in that handful of soil that we don't even know about, right? So there between bacteria and all of the living organisms that exist throughout our planet that sustain life. This is what we have to explore. There's plenty of opportunity for people to seek and achieve purpose, knowledge, and we just need to be able to value that. And we don't value that in our economic system. And that's my point, is if you want a science, not a discipline, not a dogma, if you want a science of economics, you have to incorporate that into your system. So now what I'm saying is that you can say, well, we need to change this, we need to do this, we need to flip this all around, we need to do that. But at the end of the day, you still haven't got the fundamental right. The fundamental has to be what I'm explaining. And that's why I see it as a bottom-up approach. Top-down doesn't work. Top-down's oppressive. Top-down will cause fights. Top-down is completely Marxist, which I think is toxic to a society. That's what I would have to say about it.
I think in employing a democratic process, if we choose to, as a people, come together and decide we want to move in that direction, I would welcome that. I don't view it as top down if the people are voting for it and they're putting politicians in place who are working towards that. And I think particularly in most Western democracies, if you want to make changes like that, you have to change government institutions to begin with, so that the priorities and regulations begin to realign, so that the market, like take agriculture, for example. Agriculture is the most centrally planned industry we have in this country. It is entirely planned by Department of Agriculture for price stability. If you want to change agriculture, change how you subsidize it. We could have
That's a very good point.
Farms doing multiple complementary crop planting next season, if that's what the federal government chose to subsidize. The department could come out tomorrow and say, yes, we need to end monoculture farming. It's awful, it's dangerous, it takes too many chemicals, it's a disaster. We're going to subsidize this new type of farm. You could have that farm in less than 12 months.
Right, but the same argument.
If we're going to wait on people to go out and start a homestead and buy a farm, and it'll take decades. That's sometimes where these institutions are helpful, is that we could literally get conventional farmers to move in a new direction very quickly by paying them to do it. That's where incentivized behaviors are so important. If you incentivize a behavior that's helping everybody, you get more of it. If you disincentivize it, you get less of it. You see this in the tax code all the time.
Yeah, I'll agree with you there. And even how the West was settled, in Canada, west of Winnipeg, back in, I guess, the early days of Canada, right? A lot of Americans came up to the western part of Canada, but land was given away. And why? Because it needed to be settled. And
we had the Homestead Act in this country. We were giving it away, couldn't give it away fast enough.
Right. Yeah. We're giving it. We're putting that incentive in front of people. And I think you and I are talking about similar things. And so I'll concede off my, my bandwagon of the top-down approach. It's just, I hear so much of it, so fragmented. So, well, we need this program, we need that. You sign up for this. And it's the world of the left is so populated by so many scientific and social science studies that get nowhere, and it is very top down. It's what, even economics. My good friend Steve pushes out a lot of stuff, and like I said, he's the world's greatest living economist in my opinion, but his work still doesn't touch agent-based economics. He's not really delving into what the individual agent is. And I think human potential is so strong, so amazing. We have so much ability within ourselves. We have that constellation of stars in that neural network of each individual to do so much good and so much potential. We have that within us. We just need to have a system and a society and a culture that promotes that perfectibility. And maybe I'm reaching a little bit back to ancient Greece, but it's within us. It's within a society of an eventual collapse. It's within us to be able to do that.
But that's also a very Enlightenment idea. That was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This idea that the individual should be set free from these stultifying ideas of the church, the government institutions, all this type of thing, and are free, this is Adam Smith, to create their business, to expand their business, do all of these things for themselves, for the enlightenment of themselves, to seek out knowledge and new planets and new civilizations to boldly go where. I'm just going into Star Trek now. And so that is a hardcore Enlightenment principle. Enlightenment thinkers would applaud you for saying that. And I agree. One of the reasons with my theory of individual collectivism, I say individual collectivism, is because you have to start with the individual. That was what communism was unable to accomplish in the 20th century. The Soviet system was too top-down, too planned by too many committees, no one accountable, and the individual was completely sublimated to this odious state system that did not give two shits about what people actually needed, wanted, or desired. But there's aspects of central planning that are helpful. Ask me how I know, because we use them in America. So, But so to me, it's like you have to have both. You have to start with people. And when you start with people and you make systems work for individuals, everybody benefits. All boats end up rising in this really wonderful organic way because you're incentivizing the behavior that does that. I had a mathematician on the podcast who wrote a book about how to make commodity markets more fair and get rid of speculation. And I had him on. I said, we don't really get to talk about this very often, but and his theory was that you could only buy in a commodities market if you put in honest information that was useful to the group. So if you didn't have any information to put into the system, you weren't a market participant. But if you had helpful information, then you could be a market participant, and how much business you could do depended on how much information you had and could contribute to the system, or how much of that commodity you had. And what he did is he basically created a system where speculation no longer pays. He created a system that, by the way the system works, gets rid of speculation. So you don't have all this price instability with people trying to make money without doing anything other than just making a trade on the Chicago Board of Exchange. He created a system in which if you're not contributing to the movement or the growth or the creation of those commodities, you're just not in the marketplace. And it was fascinating. I would encourage people, if we go to the Cameron Journal podcast, you can go listen to it. It's fascinating, and it kind of blew my mind. I just ended up sitting there just kind of listening to him talk. I didn't say, Liddy didn't say anything that whole episode. 42 minutes, I said nothing, because it was so fascinating. And I talked about, like, I don't think it would work in equity, because I do a lot with business and markets. And so I'm like, well, I don't think it would work with equities. He's like, no, it has to be commodities, because you have to have people contributing to the system. I think that type of idea of people contributing to the system and being able to leverage that, which is basically the labor theory of value, is a powerful component.
There you go, Marxing out on me again.
Yes, it's basically labor theory of value. It is a powerful component to helping, like, individual people do well in a system that actually honors and prioritizes their labor, as opposed to a system like we have now, which honors and prioritizes capital as an entity that seeks frictionless return above everything else. So I think we can have my point to this, the point I'm trying to get to, Dan, is that I think we can have our cake and eat it too on this one. We can both have my system that incentivizes people, and your kind of bottom up, hey, let's create this thing that helps people live this lifestyle that begins to change society. We can do both of those things, because one's going to lead into the other.
Yeah, one thing in terms of, the philosopher in me is saying that, you have to take a step back every once in a while, which I'm doing right now. And I'll say that there's a lot of overlap of what we're talking about. We're saying a lot of the same things. It's just your education, your background has basically filled your world in a little bit of a different way than I have. And we're coming at this, but if you think about it, we're saying a lot of the same thing. We still want a lot of the same end result. And I think that's fascinating. One critique as a third person in the room looking at this is, I would say much of middle class is actually funded by some of the problems that you actually describe. Okay, so for example, the housing bubble, or not the bubble, but basically the excessive value in the equity of homes that is everywhere within the boomer class, say, for example. Okay. I hear constantly in Canada, and I'm sure you hear it in the United States a lot too, housing crisis. What are we going to do? How are we going to fix it? Well, you know what? I talked to Steve Keen about it, and he says, you know what? The problem was caused by the financing sector. It's just you finance, and people it just escalates. It escalates. So the property values go all the way up. So you tell me, anybody that's, approaching retirement, that's sitting there on a $1.5 million property, that's going to say, oh, we're voting in something that's going to do everything that Dan and Cameron talked about in the show. The only thing is that your $1.5 million property is now going to be worth $250,000. Will you now vote for them? And they're going to say, hell no, you got to go. And I'm telling you,
No, I know.
It's
I have these discussions with my mother, who's sitting on a property like that with my dad, and she would be screaming. I know she's not watching because she would be typing. She would be screaming at me right now for the stuff that I have said, because as far as she's concerned, I'm ready to bring in communism and the Soviet Union to the U.S. So, she did not raise me that way and all this sort of thing. Lots of that sort of talk. No, I mean, that is definitely a factor in all of this. Yeah, it's hard to get people. I mean, it's hard to get people to vote for something that's going to materially disadvantage them. One of the biggest mistakes, and I agree with Steve, one of the biggest mistakes we ever made in this country, and Canada even has it worse, is we turned housing into a commodity, like corn and pork bellies. When it's shelter. People need tangible structures to live. That's all housing should ever be. Japan does this a very different way, and they don't have a housing crisis, and they don't have high house prices for this reason. Because they have not turned housing into an investment. In fact, most of the time, they tear down their houses every 20 years because they don't insure them beyond that, and they build new. But it also keeps land and house price speculation from going on, because people know houses have a limited lifespan. They're shelter. That's their job. They're not a commodity. They're not an investment vehicle. People aren't banking their retirement on their property. And that's the problem, is the boomers decided in the 80s that they were going to turn real estate into their retirement vehicle, especially for the working and middle class. And rather than having defined pension benefits and funding Social Security, which they did not do in this country, they got rid of the pensions and didn't fund Social Security in this country. You basically turned into put some money in your 401k, but buy a house because it will appreciate in value, and that's your retirement. This has created our present crisis, and why here in Seattle, the starting home price is $749,000.
But I will tell you this, Cameron, we go back to this idea of a complex system, or a system that one of the key characteristics of the systems is chaos in the system. Okay.
Right.
The ability to be able to give somebody in a blue collar sort of environment, right? Somebody that may have a really hard time moving up that societal ladder, being able to extend any kind of social wealth, accumulate anything, change their place in the world, I guess, right? Okay. Build equity. Well, a lot of times that happens with buying a property, renovating it, moving up. Like, these are people like my parents that have done this sort of thing. They were smart, they worked hard. And you say, could you have done that with your job? And the answer is simply no. They couldn't do that with their job. They were not sophisticated enough to play the markets. And so this actually became a vehicle for an average person to be able to do just simple things. A plumber could buy a house, could fix it up, could put some, good sweat equity into something and actually see real tangible appreciation as the market rose. Now, here we are after the fact. We're saying, well, that was bad, and that's the reason for the housing crisis and blah, 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 blah. But step me back from that edge, because you know what? That forward mobility that you were talking about, that I think we could draw some equivalents to the mercantile, I guess, analogy. We can draw some, parallels there.
Of course.
It helped. It changed society. It affected people within society greatly. So what do you think about that?
Oh, no. I mean, mercantilism, we kind of look down on it now, but at the time, it actually was a tremendous amount of opportunity for a lot of working class people. I mean, people forget. And by the way, Ralph Shoemaker, I'm loving your comments right now. Ralph's tearing it up in the comments section. And the mercantile system, the British East India Company is, to this day, the wealthiest corporation that has ever existed on the planet. They had a market cap in the trillions of inflation-adjusted dollars. The amount of working class British people that were able to go out to the colonies, get land, build a career for themselves, be in the military, create wealth for themselves, opportunity that they would have never, ever had in a billion years in their home country, was tremendous. And that was also true for the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the lot of them. That all of that system was, although highly concentrated in a relatively few hands, the wealth creation that came out of that absolutely changed lives. It changed society. It changed religion. It changed the world. I mean, it changed politics. It allowed, you know, the sale of tobacco, indigo, and cotton made the British colonies in America successful, which is why we have the United States to start with. You know,
Mm.
I mean, the fur trade in for France and Britain and Canada allowed Canada to be a thing, and to have that. I went to a museum in Calgary and they were talking about Western expansion Canada. It was fascinating. You know, all of these things at this all allowed for this to happen and be a thing. Hell, a lot of American wealth between 1790 and 1830 was based on whale oil. Yes, you heard that right. Whale oil. Like, that used to be a really hot commodity. And people built whole fortunes off of that. I mean, there were some advantages to that system, absolutely. And yes, to your point, it is allowed, and my family is full of them. My uncle was high school dropout, worked at a oil refinery in Colorado in Commerce City, and he bought real estate, bought 4 houses, and has retired very well for himself. My dad dropped out of college, joined the military, works at a government scientific agency. He's done very well for himself. I mean, and a lot of that has to do with property appreciation, rise in the stock market, all of these things. I mean, yes, there's a lot of common, average, everyday people who've been able to take, you know, money from a job, money from their working income, and buy things and do things that have set them up with tremendous wealth. And to all that, I would say that's great. No hate on any person who's taking care of them and theirs at all. I'm always solidly with the working classes. However, we could have had a better system. We could have, like the Europeans do, guaranteed half to 3/4 of your salary in retirement, no questions asked. That's what they do in Greece and Germany. We could have guaranteed, as California does, no property taxes on your house in old age. We could have had universal health care in this country, you know, with a prescription benefit, or even just make you buy your meds like they do in Canada and France and elsewhere. We could have had a better system, because the problem is the system as we've created it in this country, and I think because it's been somewhat created in Canada, although you guys have the healthcare we don't have, is that you've ended up with about the bottom third to maybe 40% of the population left out of that system. So it's like, if you're middle class and you're making 60, 70 and above, this system has been really great for you. If you're making 60, 70 and below, this system has left you behind for the last 50 years. Half of boomers don't have enough money saved in retirement in order to retire. And they've had every advantage handed to them in this country. We sold the farm for them, and they still didn't manage to save enough money. I mean, this system has left a lot of people behind, and as great as it has been, we could have had it better. We could have saved pension programs. We could have made sure Social Security would take care of everybody in their old age. We could have made sure of these things. People could have lived better, more secure lives. Home ownership actually reduces economic growth because it reduces mobility. It's one great thing about Europe that doesn't happen in the United States so much. One of the U.S. they calculated recently in the New York Times, they had an article. If people didn't own homes as much as they do in America, our GDP over the last 20 years would be 5 to 10% higher, because people could move for opportunities faster. It's a lot harder to move when you have to sell your house and go and all this type of thing. The home ownership thing holds the economy back somewhat. But to your point, it's been the greatest wealth creation vehicle probably in the history of humanity. It's just, it's something where I would go to people and say, I realize that this has been good for you, but it's not working for your children. So help me build a better way. Help me make sure that your kids are going to have a retirement, and your grandkids are going to have a retirement, that they're going to have decent public schools and decent health care. So keep your money, but I'm going to ask for some taxes to make sure that your children and your grandchildren and their children have a country that they can live in and be healthy. And that includes making sure that we're protecting our air and our water. That makes sure that we're protecting all of the things that make, you know, our countries great to live in. I would just had a story on the News Hour yesterday, the Cameron Joel News Hour, about Canada's new carbon capture program. Mr. Trudeau thinks we're going to suck the carbon from the air. It ain't going to work, but that's his new canard, and to try to save oil sands in Alberta. And that's that's uh, emblematic of the piecemeal solutions that get offered to a lot of these problems.
Yeah.
And also trying to do, in some cases I would say at the bare minimum, to try to solve a lot of these problems or save industries that are on their way out. We have it with coal in this country as coal power plants shut down in favor of natural gas and renewables. All this type of thing. This is, so I mean, I agree with you to a point. There's a lot of these things that are very hard to get rid of. It's very difficult to accomplish, and it's going to be very hard to get people to vote for something else. But ultimately, we have to start talking about a future. In all of the West, Europe is facing the same problem we are. We'll talk about France's 22% youth unemployment rate, and how Europe hasn't had a birth rate in 20 years worth a damn. I mean, all of these. I mean, we have some big challenge, and we have to stop thinking about just the present. We have to start thinking about the future. And that's one of the terrible things that we don't necessarily do so much here in the United States, is we tend to only think of life from presidential election to presidential election, which gives us about a 4-year forecast. The Chinese are very smart. They think in decades and centuries. They're the oldest civilization on the planet for a reason. They've been around for 6,000 years. They've been around the block. They think in decades and centuries. We have to start thinking like that. And we don't.
Yeah, but does that imply a centralized planned economy with the same kind of power that the Chinese government has?
I would hope not. I don't think the Chinese system is anything. I mean, I think a lot of developed countries envy it for its fast growth and success, but the reality is there's a lot of rot at the center of the Chinese system. I would not say, oh, let's go to Beijing and study what they've been doing and bring it back here to the United States. I think there's a lot we can do within our existing structures. I think we have to change the incentives. Right now, we incentivize money for nothing. That's why we have mortgage-backed securities. That's why we have so much money dumping into housing. That's why we have whole companies whose job it is to just make money from speculation. If we change the incentives by taxing them, making them illegal, all this type of thing, it changes the market calculus of the market participants, and they do different things. Stock buybacks were illegal till 1980 because they didn't want companies manipulating their stock price. The reality is we haven't had stock market growth in this country this past decade because the only growth has been companies buying back stock. I mean, because that's what we incentivize. Change the incentives, and the system starts to shift on its own like a river. So I'm just saying, let's build some levees along the river and get it to go another way. I don't want to control the river. I just want to move it a little.
Yeah, trying to control the river would be kind of a fool's errand, I think.
Ask the Chinese. Ironically, they know how that does not work. Yeah, I just want to move it a little. I want to redirect it a little bit and try to make it as navigable as possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right. Well, how are we for time? Should we go for another 20 minutes and then shut her down?
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. They're having a great discussion in the comments section. I love extended clips as well. We need to relearn how to love each other for us and not what we can gain from each other. Amen. And also their contributions on the Islamic finance system have been really awesome. I just started learning. I've been studying classical Arabic philosophy, and I've just been learning about Islamic economics and their banks that don't charge interest and all this type of thing. And it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know enough to talk competently about it yet, but in the comment section, they're having a great conversation. So I that's definitely worth reading, and that's been great to kind of see out the corner of my eye going on.
So Cameron, tell me about your book, because we want to give a copy of your book away in soup fashion to the commenter of your choice, and I'd like you to explain your book and tell me about. And then you're going to choose who to give it away to, right?
Yeah. So What the Hell is Going On? A Primer for Our World in the Age of Trump is a collection of essays I wrote on what is now called the Cameron Journal between 2014 and 2019. And it is really a handbook of a little bit of everything. There is talk about capitalism, labor participation, climate change, genetically modified foods and why they're going to save the planet and why we should embrace them, not get rid of them. I have long essays on what's wrong with the American education system. I have a long essay on racism. I will say we shouldn't give away a copy of the book as it stands now. What we should do is write this person's name down, and if they give me a couple months, the new edition is coming out through Soup very soon. I've revised all the essays, I've updated them, and added tons of new commentary. And so there's a lot of great stuff I'm discussing in the new book. I'm discussing cybersecurity, domestic terrorism. My master's degree is in terrorism and asymmetrical warfare, so I'm discussing domestic terrorism. I'm also getting into Black Lives Matter, woke culture, and some of the culture war stuff as well. There's also in that book a great bit on conspiracy theory and misinformation and disinformation and malinformation. So it's going to be a powerhouse. It's going to be a lot thicker than the old one, but it's going to be a powerhouse. It's going to be tremendous. It's going to be great. And I think there's a lot to be gained from that. The great thing, what I'm proud of, is I've written it in such a way that you can be very liberal or very conservative, and this book is for you. I literally gave a copy away of the original to the man who delivered the hay for my aunt's horses, and he was into it. I had, my last publication I owned before the Cameron Journal, I hired my tech editor, who was a dyed-in-the-wool QAnon MAGA Trump supporter and loved my book. So I tell people, don't let the title scare you. It's not for left or right. I don't live in that binary. I don't live in that world. Just read it, grok it. You can agree with me. You can disagree with me. You're going to find something you love in there. Because I go through and try to look at things in this very kind of 360-degree view. So that's what the hell is going on. And we should pick somebody out and take their name down. And when the new edition comes out in a couple of months, we will give we'll send them a copy, and I'll sign it for making them wait. But the new edition is going to be so much better. I edited, I revised, I really upgraded the whole experience. So, and the new edition is going to get published through Soup, so it's probably going to be on different paper, and it's going to be really different from what I've been doing. So, I think it'll be really cool.
I see that Ty left a comment. He was a guest on the show a few weeks ago, and he got a new job. Congratulations, Ty. This is really good of you. I think that's really good that you're working again, Ty.
It's always good to see a scrappy come up story. It's always good to see a scrappy come up story. But yeah, I really it's not a name of a person, but I think it's the name of their channel. It's Extended Clips. I've been loving their comments, and I think they deserve a copy of the book when it comes out in a couple of months. So I would encourage them to be in touch with us, and we'll send them a copy in due course, because it's gonna be a lot of fun. It's gonna be really great, and taking on a lot of stuff and also talking a lot about how things have changed since I first wrote the book. Because I first started writing that in 2014, I put it out in 2019, and a lot has changed. And I actually had to kind of make modifications, because I started working on it right as the pandemic started. And I've had to change a lot because the pandemic changed everything. So, and the other book I'm releasing this year also kind of suffers from that, with America's Lost Generation. I've had to go back through and make some change. I optimistically said, "Oh, the pandemic will be over in the spring of 2021." Well, I had to erase that line a year later. So, but yeah, let's get a free copy out to them when it's done and available. So
tell me, Cameron, about being an author. When was your first book?
2019. What the hell was going on was my very first book.
Oh,
I was that was my first foray into self-publishing and working with Ingram and doing book layout and everything. And I took all the essays from all of the big essays that had gone viral from the Cameron Journal. I added in some new ones that were original, which is Racism in Education. And that was my very first book. So I learned a lot. It went really well. It took a long time because I was learning. I literally had like a YouTube video on how to do book layout on one screen and InDesign on the other, and like was very carefully doing the whole process. And it took a lot to learn. There's some stuff about it that I would definitely change, which is why we're doing a new edition this year.
Well, I'm working with Soup, which is a whole different thing. So what would you say to somebody that instead of doing it themselves, because there's a lot to do, right? I mean, even though we have self-publishing, that's a lot to do. What would you say to somebody that, should they work with a publisher, or should they try and do it on their own? What can you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I'm launching this summer is my writing coaching program, where I'm helping people write their story and decide if they're going to go traditional, small press, self-publishing, all this type of thing. I would say you need to find the publishing path that works best for you. There are some people that only want to do trad pub, and bless them. I went down that road, got super close, but no cigar. There's some people that love small and indie press. One of the reasons I was attracted to Soup is because it was small and indie press. And I'm into the small and indie press scene and the hybrid scene, all this type of thing. For some people, especially if you only want to publish one book, or you're just kind of doing your memoirs, all this type of thing, I think self-publishing is more suitable. I did 3 books in a year and a half. And this is what I do, literally what I do. And so one of the things when I started working with Soup is we talked about my book production all the way out to 2026. So I think working with a publisher, if you're doing this consistently and you have other work that you want to produce, I think indie small press is great. I think even trad pub can be great. Self-publishing is really great if you have maybe 1-2 projects, or you're doing a small series or this type of thing. But it is a lot of work because you have to do the layout, you have to do the cover, and there's stuff to buy, there's expense to it. And then once you get done with all of that, you then have to go market. Some people said getting a book done, that's literally step 1 of about 10 other things that have to be done. So I would say, if you're looking for a great small and indie press, I have to recommend Soup because I'm working with them now, and we're going to be doing great things. And there's definitely, I think Soup offers a very particular and a really great opportunity for people. But you have to find the publishing path that works best for you, and that makes sense for your writing journey. And if people need help with that, call me.
It's not everybody is not everybody is a fit for the publisher either. Speaking for Soup at all, but not everybody is a fit for. There's one publisher here on Vancouver Island, on Gabriola Island, that is pretty much homegrown, climate change, end of the world sort of stuff, right? Just to vignette it for somebody. I'm using hyperbole here, but basically the thing is that they're looking for particular types, and so Soup looks for particular types of. Well, and
there's small publishers that do very spiritual stuff. There's one in Boulder whose name I'm blanking on right now. In Boulder, Colorado. I used to drive by to go to work every day. Can't think of the name right now. And they folk. My work is totally unsuitable for them.
That was God censoring you. That was God censoring you. So He created in the image of God. You got that brand right up on your head there. So He just censored you for using the lipid experiments. It just experiments. He just gave you brain freeze there, right?
Yeah. No, that is 110% the case. There are definitely different publishers for different things. Same thing with agents. If you're going on a traditional publishing route, you need an agent that knows how to represent your work. So like if you're doing women's led fiction, don't go for an agent that primarily represents nonfiction. The converse is also true. If you're writing nonfiction, you need to be with an agent who represents that and has the connections to get that book sold. You don't want to work with a person who does women-led fiction. So it's really, if there's one thing I can say about having been courted by 2 big New York agencies, you have to have the right book to the right agent at the right time. And then they have to go out to publishers and get your book in front of them to the right editor at the right time.
Yeah.
This is where a small and indie press is a little bit easier because you're closer to it. You don't have to work with an agent. Wade and I are working together directly. I don't have an agent sort of thing. That's where small and indie press can be really helpful. Self-publishing can also be helpful if you're willing to put in the hours, the work, and the money. Let's face it, putting out your own book effectively isn't cheap. Ask me how I know. And so, but it's all about finding the right pathway for you.
Interesting. Okay. Well, on that note, let's wrap it up. And
yeah, it's always a delight, man.
Yeah, we're going to say to Extended Clips, just send us a note, and you can send an email, and you can respond on any of the channels. I think you're on the Plank Sip channel, so just send a note there. If you go to the About, there's my emails in there. You can go in there and just send me an email, give me your information, and then we'll mail you out a copy of Cameron's book when it gets published and released through Soup coming up here in the next few months.
Yep.
And until then, until next Tuesday night, same time, same place, I'm Daniel Sanderson. This is Cameron Lee Cowan, and that's a wrap. Thanks, guys.